my rigid heddle weavers. Tammy Poff here, Poff Studio. I've got a little secret for you today. As experienced weavers who make videos, we'd like to make it look like we're in control of all those little mishaps that can occur while we're weaving. Well, here's the secret. Stuff happens. Well, maybe that's not such a secret for most of you. But I'd like to share with you my 5 favorite rescues for when stuff happens in my weaving. So we're going to talk about set, fell line, challenges to good salvages, broken threads, and fixing flaws in your weaving. I'm a big advocate of testing unknown yarn combinations with a swatch before you leap into a mistake that could cost you several hundred yards. But sometimes I do jump in anyway and find that I'm just not happy with the warp set that I chose. In this case, I chose an 8-dent reed. And by the way, warp set, S-E-T-T, that's the ends per inch, or EPI, and that's established by the reed size. In this case, I had actually tied on to the front, wove a header, did a little weaving, and decided I'd be much happier at 10 ends per inch. Now, this next step you won't have to do if you have a loom that has double heddle, like my flip here. But if you're working on the little loom without that opportunity, in order to transfer to a different size reed, what I'll do is place that in front of the original reed in the down position. By the way, you may notice that I have rubber bands on each side of my reed as it sits in neutral. If you have a loom like this one with open-ended sides, that's a little trick I like to use to keep the reed from shifting side to side as I'm warping. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is anchor my 10-dent reed, just the bottom of it, to the heddle block. And I'm going to do that on each side. Then I can let it angle forward a bit so I can see what I'm doing. And obviously, if I condense down from an 8-dent reed to a 10-dent reed with the same number of ends, I'm going to have a narrower warp. So if I want to retain that same warp width, I'm going to start where I originally did on the back reed, and then I'm going to add some more warp later. Now, you may already know that it's important to keep your warp threads in some semblance of order. Otherwise, you may get excess crossing in the back, and that will keep you from opening a nice clean shed while you're weaving. So in order to keep them in the same order, I'm going to take them out of the back reed one thread at a time. And I'm going to bypass the back reed over the top, and I'll start in the same place that I did on my original reed and pull that first thread through the front slot. Then I'm going to take a whole thread out, and that one will go into a hole. Now that I've made it all the way over to the left side, down to the last 2 ends, and I've checked along the way that every time I pull a thread out of a slot, it goes into a slot in the front, and all the hole threads have gone into the holes. That way I don't skip any spaces along the way. Now all I've got to do is get that 8-dent reed out of the way. So I'll remove the rubber bands, slide it out from under, and the rubber bands come off the front reed, and it goes into place, and I'm ready to add more warp. So at this point, I'm going to tie a little knot in the front of my warp ends so that I keep these together. And you can go ahead and replace rubber bands. Keep that 10-dent reed sticky and in place. And you're going to take your warp off the back all the way until the apron rod is exposed. Now at this point, I have just a little test warp here, so it's very short, but if you had a long warp, you just pull it all the way out. Your threads will need to scooch to the right on that left-hand side so they're going straight through the reed. And your center string will have to be adjusted to the right as well a little bit. That would be fine. And here would be where I would add more work. All I would do at this point is clamp my loom to the table again, measure my distance to the peg, and I can drop the first set of threads. Then I'll just measure how far out I have to start in order to add more work, tie on, and draw loops for the remainder of what I need to keep this width where it was before. Okay, let's pretend that we've added that extra warp to fill out our width, that we have rolled onto the back beam all of that work together and packed our warp, that we have tied onto the front with our bows and knots, checked the tension, wove the header, did a little weaving. Now let's talk about fell line. Oh look, I have a little hill in my fell line. Your fell line is the last pick that you threw, and that's what we're trying to get straight across. And when there's a little hill like that, you're identifying a bundle of threads that you didn't tighten as well as you did the others. I like to always, when I'm doing anything serious besides swatching, tie onto the front with a half a knot secured by a bow. There's a number of reasons. Number one, my bow saves about 6 inches of fringe for me. When it comes off the loom, it's much easier to pull out bows and then half knots than double knots. And when I have a little hill like that, where I've missed tensioning, I just untie the bow, and with the tassels, I squeeze the knot, and I can pull that hill right out of there. There you go, improved fell line. Now, the other thing that can impact your fell line is we're often a little stronger on one side than the other. And when you discover that about yourself, you might find that you're weaving uphill on the weaker side. Then you can simply compensate by beating a little harder on that side so that you get a straight fell line. So let's talk about optimal salvages. I detail this in my book, Woven Style for the 15-inch rigid heddle loom. And unlike floor loom weavers, we have to deal with slots. Everything they do goes through a hole, and we don't get quite the tension that they do, so we have to treat things a little differently. One thing that I found is I get the best salvages when my fabric width draws in about 10% from the original warp width. That means if I warped 6 inches here, that I want my fabric to probably end up just under, maybe around 5.5 inches. And here's how I weave for the best salvages. What I do is throw my shuttle, set my edge by sticking my finger right in the open shed and flicking the far side down to a nice sharp point. Now this takes the guesswork out of edges because I want that point to land right on top of the point that came before it. No guesswork. Then I allow about a 35-degree angle on this triangle. That's for DK weight. If I had a worsted weight, I might want to allow 45 degrees for the angle to give it a little more slack for that over-under bending. And a lighter weight yarn like lace, I may have very little rise, a very low triangle. Every yarn weight and every salvage has a happy place. What we're after is we're trying to get the two outermost salvage threads to be a little closer together than the inner threads, but you don't want to pull so hard that you make one salvage thread tumble under the one next to it. So experiment with that till you get the look you want. Show you one more time. Throw it. Flick your finger in there and set it, 35 degrees, give it a beat, and move on. Now I'm going to embellish on that just a little bit. Most of us find that we have one side of our work that is a little looser than the other side. And there's a lot of reasons they attribute to that too. It could be the fact that one side has a hole and one side has a slot. Could be the fact that you're right-handed or left-handed. I think it's a combination of factors. But what I do when I find that, for example, if my left side is a little looser, all I've got to do is set a lower angle. That subtle difference can sharpen up that loose edge without thinking too hard about it. and a higher angle when I throw from the right. Now, sometimes the yarn that you use can affect the quality of your edges. Here's an example. I like to use a dark warp to take what would otherwise be a rather dull warp thread and make it glow. But what happens if you have a lot of contrast between your weft thread and your warp threads, you do have to live with the fact that your edges are not going to look quite as crisp. Here with the second example, where I used a weft that matches my warp thread, you can see that my edge is a lot crisper, even though I used the same weights for both projects. Broken warp threads. I always promise my students that if they weave long enough, they're going to break a warp end right in the middle of their weaving. And that's usually not your fault. That might be a flaw in the yarn. That might be a knot in the warp. It might be because you shredded the warp end as you were slaying the reed. But either way, not to worry. It's easy to repair. I carry around my little repair kit. That would be a vitamin bottle or a pill bottle. And inside, I have a coin for weight. This is a quarter. It could be 5 pennies. Doesn't have to be a lot of weight. I also normally carry inside a T-pin. And what I'm going to do is the old broken end off the back, we're going to toss it away and cut it away. We're going to anchor the broken front end to the fabric by placing the T-pin so that the head of the pin is right where that broken thread existed. And I weave that in a little bit so it's secure. And we're going to wrap around the head of the T-pin, the old end, and now it's anchored. And then I'm going to cut a new replacement thread, and I'll cut that as long as I need to finish my weaving, plus another 10% for the take-up, plus a foot or so to hang off the back. Start the new end by wrapping it once again around the head of the T-pin. If you do that in a figure 8, it'll hold a little better. And I also like to make a little half knot tie so I know it's going to stay attached to the T-pin throughout the rest of my weaving. I can pick that out later. Now what you'll do is slay that replacement end where the original broken thread existed, and the yarn on the back is going to drape over the top of our weight. And we're going to cap that off. And now this will hang off the back of the loom between you, and if you're like me working on a table edge here, it'll drape down between you and the table. And now you can continue to weave, and you won't even know that it's there until you take a break and you have that pill bottle hanging there. Now, I'm going to show you how to finish that off in just a moment. One more thing before I show you how to finish off flaws in your fabric. Sometimes we're skimmers. In fact, we all skim once in a while. I'm talking about these little weft floats that occur by accident when you're throwing your shuttle through an open shed and you accidentally exit the shed and skim over a few warp threads. Now that's rather extreme, but sometimes those things are subtle and they hide from you until after the fabric comes off the loom. I might recommend, first of all, that rather than passing your shuttle flat through the opening, you might want to try tilting that shuttle away from you on an angle every time you throw. That way, it'll help you avoid skimming because the prongs will catch on the warp thread and stop you. Our project is done and off the loom, and now we have just a couple of flaws we want to fix before the wash. First, we have the T-pin where the broken thread occurred, and resist the temptation to remove that T-pin anytime before it comes off the loom and the tension is released. Now you can go ahead and pick out the knot that you tied. Remove the T-pin, and ends for weft, tails for weft and warp, they're woven in as we go. So they're not going to unravel, except that we have a couple rules about these little tails. Number one, you don't want tails ending at your selvages because they'll shift a little and make a little gap. And you don't want two ends, or two tails rather, to end in the same place because they'll shift a little and make a little hole there. So very simply, to finish these off, all we have to do is weave one of the ends away from the other. I'll thread my tapestry needle, and now I'm just going to weave that end alongside another warp thread under over just a little ways to get it away from the other warp thread. Then after washing, we can go ahead and trim these. I wait till after washing to trim them because they will shift in the wash, poke their little heads up, and have to be trimmed again. Now, when you have one of these little skips that occur, if you discover that after it comes off the loom, that can be repaired as well. All we do is cut that skip in the middle. Now, if it's a real tiny skip, you may cut it and unravel it a little bit further. Notice where we cut our weft that there are two weft threads that now share the same shed, and they need a replacement weft in between to fill in the gap. So I'm going to load my needle with a piece of weft yarn, and I want to start about 3/8 or half an inch before the first cut weft thread there, and I want to weave alongside that thread in the same shed so that I get an overlap the same way we would tuck tails as we weave. And when I get to the two cozy little weft threads that are sharing the same shed, I'm going to wedge in between them to fill in that gap. And when I get to the other side, I want to go beyond that cut end so I get an overlap on the other side too. And now my replacement weft has filled in that gap, and after washing we can trim those tails and problem solved.